Hey guys, today we're going to talk about cluster munitions and DPICM, or dual purpose improved conventional munitions, why they're going to Ukraine, what Ukraine might be using them for, why they're a good idea in some situations, why they're a bad idea in other situations, and why Russia does not like the idea of these munitions heading to Ukraine. First of all, I'm going to do this a little bit differently. This is going to be more of a podcast style thing. I'm going to use some notes down here instead of speaking and using graphics. It's just a faster way to get this information out. So feel free to light up a smoke and grab some whiskey. This shouldn't take that long, but it's going to be a lot of good information. So first of all, cluster munitions were invented in the 1950s-ish. And it was an excellent way of taking out soft-skinned targets. We're talking about soldiers, we're talking about vehicles, radar installations. It's actually a great way of doing iron hand. When you detect radar, you drop a cluster munition on that radar. You don't need to score a direct hit. These things were also used in Vietnam very extensively. Basically, a cluster munition, think of like this cigarette lighter right here. So think of this cigarette lighter packed with BBs that can explode, or ball bearings. And when this is launched toward the target, when it gets close to the actual target, it'll split open, releasing all those submunitions, or bomblets as they're called. Now, the reason that these cluster munitions were so useful is that, at least when it comes to aircraft, it's hard to drop a bomb. Yeah, you're flying at a certain speed, and the target might be moving, and there's wind, and people are shooting at you. So it might actually be hard to drop a single bomb and have it hit near where the target you want, or at least it was hard to do before the advent of precision-guided munitions. Well, back in the 50s, back in Vietnam, this was a way of servicing a target. Now, the problem with these cluster munitions is that when the actual canister opens and these bomblets come out, these submunitions are banging against each other. And this happens at a rate of maybe 1 to 3%. These submunitions will hit each other midair while they're falling. And that causes duds. So by dud, that means the submunition might not actually explode. In American submunitions for things like the 155 howitzers, 155 howitzer shells, you get a submunition dud rate of about 1 to 3%. In older Soviet and Russian submunitions, you get a dud rate of about 40%. And Russia uses submunitions quite extensively even today. And the reason is that it's just easier. Russian weapons, they don't tend to have precision-guided weapons. They have some. So just to hit your target, think of the submunitions as essentially a cheat code. That's what Preston Stewart has called submunitions, and he's an artillery officer. Submunitions are a cheat code guaranteeing that you can blanket your target. So the problem with these duds is that when they hit the ground, they're still dangerous. And they essentially become landmines at that point. And so years later, after the conflict is over, you might be walking through a field and you step on one of those submunitions, and that's a big problem. So that being said, these days, submunitions aren't that useful. They would still be a useful tool if you're attacking soft-skinned targets, soldiers out in the open, like massed amounts of soldiers out in the open. And this particular kind of submunition shell we're saying to Ukraine is called DPICM, which means dual purpose improved conventional munitions. Essentially, there's 88 shaped charge warheads that are packed inside of an artillery shell. And when these warheads hit their target, they're a shaped charge warhead which can cut through 4 centimeters of steel armor. They'll also explode and shrapnel will come out, and that can be devastating to personnel. But remember that 4 centimeters of steel armor. It's going to be important later. Now, these particular submunitions aren't necessarily that useful in Ukraine. at least not for the certain kind of applications that we think that they need artillery for. And that would be essentially counterattack, destroying Russian trench lines. A conventional high explosive 155 shell would be a much better alternative to submunitions on a trench line. And there's a very simple reason why. Because trench lines traditionally have bunkers. And you might, if you know you're under attack, you run directly under that bunker. Now, if you get a direct hit on that bunker, the 155, it just wasn't your day. But submunitions, think of them as grenades. Higher explosive than a grenade, but they're still grenades. And so these rounds might be coming in and they're exploding near you, but you're under a bunker, you're fairly safe. So they're not that good at clearing trenches. Another problem is that when you fire submunitions, you're essentially seeding your own minefield. You might say, oh, well, less than 1 to 3% dud rate isn't that bad. Well, if you fire 1 shells, that might be 1 to 3 rounds become duds. Then you fire a fire mission of 6 guns firing 3 rounds each. Now that's 18 shells that are in the air. Now you have a whole battalion firing. So you can see how the dud rate becomes a minefield very quickly. So essentially, you can't use these submunitions at any kind of target that you intend to assault. The Marines figured that out in Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom, where the Marines essentially attacked areas that had been attacked with submunitions, and they ran right into their own submunitions, and some Marines became casualties. So, that being said, here's what I think Ukraine is going to do with these submunitions, or with these DPICM munitions. I think that Ukraine is going to use these submunitions as intended against thin-skinned targets, troops in the open, stuff like that. That might be going on in some locations. And I believe the United States has told Ukraine that if you do use these weapons, you must keep track of where you're firing these weapons so we can demine them later. Yeah, these weapons are going to kill civilians later. But you know what else is killing civilians? Russians. You know, like it's kind of which devil are you picking here? The Russians who are firing cluster munitions at civilians intentionally, or firing cluster munitions in self-defense, which could harm people later. I mean, both options are both situations are bad, but one is kind of worse because they're doing it intentionally. Now, that being said, I think the use case is going to be Ukraine is going to take these 155 shells that we're donating, these DPICM shells. They're going to crack them open, and now you have 88 submunitions that you can put on a drone and you can fly over a Russian tank and drop. And I think the Russians are scared all hell over this, because it means you're taking a fairly effective weapon that can go through 4 centimeters of armor. And remember, the armor on the top of a tank or any kind of armored fighting vehicle, it's usually the thinnest armor on the vehicle. So this weapon can be very deadly against Russian vehicles. So I think Russia's really scared of that. And essentially, they've started this propaganda campaign. And it's actually the first time I've seen the harvesting phase. You know, typically, Russian propaganda works in seeding, harvesting, and amplification. Like, Russia skipped seeding. They went straight to harvesting and amplification. They almost went straight to amplification, because you have prominent people, journalists, and some Russian sophists, and even some people who are famous for being gadflies, like JFK Jr., who I don't know if they were instructed or whether they just kind of, I don't know. I don't know how they all came up with the same idea at the same time, but essentially, if you search, if you do an and search or an or search, really, for the word cluster and horrific, you start to see the same words pop up in social media. Cluster bombs are horrific weapons. Cluster bombs are horrific weapons. They're using the same exact language. It's actually brilliant. Russia's really good at information warfare. They're excellent at it. And we have no counter to this. Well, I guess we do. We have me. We have a couple of other people that kind of go, wait a minute, this is misinformation. So another thing, people talk about war crimes, whether cluster munitions are a war crime. That's a tough one, because there are some nations that have signed on to a treaty saying that they're not going to use cluster munitions or anti-personnel cluster munitions. The United States has not signed that treaty. Russia has not signed that treaty. But the U.S. usually doesn't sign treaties, but still kind of abides by them anyway. Like, America never signed the landmine ban treaty because we wanted to keep our landmines in Korea. But we still kind of abide by the landmine treaty because we don't even teach soldiers how to employ anti-personnel landmines anymore. I don't even think there's any more anti-personnel landmines in the inventory. But I also thought there was no more DPICM in the inventory. So there may be some, and again, I didn't think there was DPICM in the inventory because we don't even talk about that. Like, it was never even an option to use. So I'm kind of surprised we even still have DPICM shells. Another thing that you've heard the president say it, President Biden. There's another general that said it, that the reason they're sending these munitions to Ukraine is that Ukraine is running out of ammunition. But you notice they say the word running out of ammunition. They don't say what kind of ammunition. And so I think this is another reason why Ukraine is probably going to take these 155 shells, break them open, take out these 88 bomblets, and use these directly against Russia. There may still be some circumstances where Ukraine uses them in the manner to which you would assume you would use a cluster munition. But I think that's how they're going to do it. And all of the signs are there because it's most likely the most effective use of this munition, since these munitions will not work against trenches. One more thing. I want to talk about minefields for a second. Cluster bombs are not necessarily effective against minefields. And one funny thing being in this position is that people keep coming to me with these ideas of destroying Russian minefields. Like, what if we used a hovercraft to go over the minefield really fast? What if we use monkeys and we shoot bananas into the minefield? And cluster munitions aren't necessarily effective against a minefield either, because you're creating a minefield as you're trying to blow up the mines in the minefield. So you're creating more of a problem. So that's actually pretty much it. This is kind of the truth about cluster munitions. I'll be keeping an eye on this, but I believe that ultimately Ukraine is going to take most of these 155 howitzer shells. They're going to open them up. They're going to take the DPICM bomblets, and they're going to put them on drones and individually drop them on Russian targets, which will really reduce the possible dud rate because they're not banging into each other as they're released from their container. Thank you guys so much for watching.
Oh, hi, America. It's me, Elon. If you want to be cool like me, go and get a Ryan McBeth t-shirt or hoodie from Bunker Branding. I'm going to get a HIMARS shirt because it fires rockets, and rockets are pretty cool, just like me. Ha ha, you fool. It is me, Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, and I will be the coolest once I get a Patriot shirt because the system is fully automated, just like me. I'm going to get a U.S. Navy Department of the Boat People hoodie because I love their management style. Now, I will be cooler than any of you lads once I get my drone sweet drone shirt.
No, I'm going to get a landmine marker shirt because they blow up just like Windows.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm going to get.
Oh no, it is Steve Wozniak from Apple.
That's right, you nerds. You think you're the coolest for wearing a shirt? Well, Ryan McBeth is all the work, yeah. So go buy a shirt from Bunker Branding to fund Ryan McBeth to increase your understanding. Oh, yeah!